It is just after lunchtime on a surprisingly warm January day in Boston, 1919. You are walking through the narrow streets of the North End, past horses and wagons, children playing near the docks, workers sitting outside to enjoy the sun. Suddenly, you hear a deep rumble, like distant thunder, then a rapid popping sound, like machine gun fire. You turn toward the waterfront just in time to see something impossible. A wall of dark brown liquid, as tall as a 2- or 3-story building, racing toward you faster than a person can run. It is not water, it is molasses, millions of gallons of it, and there is nowhere to go. A few seconds later, Boston's North End is drowning in syrup. This is the story of the Great Molasses Flood of 1919, one of the strangest and deadliest industrial disasters in American history. On January 15th of that year, a giant steel tank filled with molasses suddenly ruptured, unleashing a wave that tore through streets, crushed buildings, and killed 21 people, injuring about 150 more. For days, rescuers waded through sticky, chest-deep goo searching for survivors. For years after, residents swore that on hot days, the North End still smelled like molasses. To understand how an entire neighborhood could be devastated by something we usually pour on pancakes, you have to understand what molasses meant in 1919. In the early 20th century, molasses was not just a sweetener. It was a critical industrial ingredient. From molasses, companies produced industrial alcohol, which was used in everything from munitions and explosives to antifreeze and other chemicals. During World War I, industrial alcohol was incredibly profitable because it was vital for making weapons and other war supplies. The company at the center of this story was United States Industrial Alcohol, or USIA, through its subsidiary, the Purity Distilling Company. They built a massive storage tank on Commercial Street in the North End of Boston, right next to the harbor, a busy area packed with dock workers, stables, rail lines, and tenement housing. The tank was meant to hold molasses arriving by ship from the Caribbean until it could be piped or shipped to a distillery in nearby Cambridge. This was no ordinary tank. It stood about 50 feet tall, roughly the height of a 5-story building, and about 90 feet in diameter. When full, it could hold around 2.3 million gallons of molasses, weighing about 13,000 tons. Imagine a structure the size of a small apartment block, made of steel plates, filled to the brim with heavy, sticky syrup. That enormous weight was resting on a relatively small footprint, in a neighborhood crowded with people. From almost the moment it was built in 1915, the tank showed signs of trouble. Locals reported that it groaned and creaked when it was filled. More worrying, it leaked. People in the neighborhood saw molasses seeping from the rivet holes and running down the sides. Children famously brought pails and cups to collect the thick, free syrup that dripped from the tank's seams. Instead of properly reinforcing the structure, company managers reportedly painted the tank a darker color to hide the leaks. Why was it built so poorly? Investigations later suggested that USIA rushed the tank's construction to cash in on wartime demand. There is evidence that the design was under-engineered, the steel walls too thin, and the rivets not strong enough to withstand the pressure of a full load. The tank was never properly tested when it was first filled, and the company did not bring in structural engineers to check it. From a modern safety perspective, it was a disaster waiting to happen. By early 1919, the war had just ended, but the tank was still nearly full. A shipment of warm molasses from the Caribbean had arrived on January 13th and been pumped into the tank, mixing with older, colder molasses that had been sitting there. At the same time, Boston was experiencing a sudden warm spell. Days earlier, temperatures had been near freezing, but by January 15th they had climbed to around 40 degrees Fahrenheit, which for Boston in January felt unseasonably mild. Those temperature swings and the mixing of warm and cold molasses created a dangerous situation inside the tank. As the warm molasses mixed with the cooler syrup, it likely fermented and produced gas, increasing the internal pressure. The steel walls of the tank expanded slightly with the warmth. All of this put extra stress on a structure that was already marginal. Modern engineers who have studied the disaster agree on one key point. The tank was underdesigned and structurally weak. The extra pressure and stress were more than it could handle. Shortly after 12:30 p.m. on Wednesday, January 15, 1919, people in the North End heard a low rumble. Some thought it was a train going by on the nearby elevated line. Others described a sound like a machine gun as rivets shot out of the tank. Then came a roar, like a crashing building or an explosion. In that moment, the tank split open. Witnesses saw the round steel sides of the tank peel away and collapse. Out of the ruptured shell poured an enormous wave of molasses. Estimates vary, but reports at the time described a wall of syrup 15 to 25 feet high and about 160 feet wide, moving at around 35 miles per hour, about as fast as a city streetcar. The molasses weighed millions of pounds and behaved almost like a liquid avalanche, picking up debris as it moved. The wave slammed into everything in its path. It smashed the walls of nearby warehouses and knocked a 4-story brick building off its foundation. A small freight railroad structure was swept away. The elevated train tracks were twisted and bent, though luckily an oncoming train was brought to a stop before it derailed. A nearby firehouse was hit so hard it was pushed off its base and collapsed, trapping firefighters inside. People and animals had no chance to get out of the way. Horses were swept up and drowned. Workers eating lunch outside were knocked over and buried under sticky debris. 2 children playing by a wagon load of molasses barrels were engulfed and killed. A truck was reportedly hurled through a fence by the force of the wave. In just a few seconds, 2 city blocks were inundated. Then, as quickly as it had surged, the wave slowed. Molasses is much thicker than water, and in the cold January air it began to stiffen. The syrup that had raced like a liquid wall started to behave more like glue or quicksand. People found themselves trapped, unable to move their legs or pull their arms free. Some were pinned under collapsed structures, with molasses rising around them. For those caught under the surface, it was almost impossible to breathe. Every attempt to inhale pulled more sticky fluid into their mouths and noses. Emergency calls went out immediately. Police, firefighters, and sailors from a ship docked nearby rushed to the scene. They had to fight through knee to waist-deep molasses to reach victims. Rescuers used planks and ladders to distribute their weight and avoid sinking. They hacked through wooden debris and waded into dark, sticky pools where cries for help could be heard. The rescue work went on into the night, with lanterns and spotlights reflecting off a landscape coated in brown syrup. Some people were pulled out alive, covered head to toe in molasses, shivering in the cold air as blankets and first aid were rushed to them. Others were not so lucky. In many cases, rescuers found bodies only after hours of digging. Some were so badly battered by debris and suffocated by molasses that identification was difficult. In the days that followed, search teams and even dogs were used to locate victims buried in hardened sludge and wreckage. In the end, 21 people died in the Great Molasses Flood, and around 150 were injured. Many of the dead were laborers working in nearby yards, teamsters driving horse-drawn wagons, and residents who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. The property damage was enormous. Dozens of buildings destroyed or badly damaged, vehicles ruined, and the cleanup effort alone took weeks. Workers eventually resorted to using seawater from fireboats to hose down the streets, flushing molasses and debris into Boston Harbor, which reportedly turned brown and sticky. Newspapers across the country seized on the story. At first, some people reacted with a kind of dark humor. The idea of drowning in molasses sounded absurd, but as reporters described the gruesome reality, crushed bodies, suffocation, people stuck and slowly dying in the cold, the tone became more serious. Local papers ran headlines about a molasses tsunami or a sticky wave of death. The event quickly entered Boston folklore. For decades afterward, residents said that on a hot summer day you could still smell molasses in the North End. In the immediate aftermath, people wanted answers. How could this have happened? Who was to blame? USIA at first tried to deflect responsibility. One theory they floated was that anarchists, political radicals who had carried out bombings in the United States around that time, had sabotaged the tank with explosives. The idea was that the tank had been destroyed in an act of terrorism, not by the company's negligence. However, investigators and engineers quickly found no evidence of a bomb. What they did find was a badly built tank. The steel walls were thinner than they should have been for the load they carried. Some of the steel was brittle, lacking enough manganese to make it tough. There were no proper engineering calculations done before construction, and the tank had reportedly leaked from the day it was first filled. All of this pointed toward a structural failure, not an act of sabotage. The flood triggered a massive legal battle. More than 100 lawsuits were filed against United States Industrial Alcohol on behalf of victims, their families, and businesses. These were eventually consolidated into what amounted to one of the first major class action style proceedings in American history. The case went on for years, with a court-appointed auditor hearing testimony from hundreds of witnesses, including engineers, survivors, and company officials. The legal proceedings were important for another reason. They relied heavily on expert witnesses and scientific evidence. Engineers testified about steel thickness, rivet strength, and how temperature changes and internal pressure could have caused the tank to fail. This was still relatively new territory for courts, using technical experts to weigh in on industrial accidents and corporate responsibility. After about 5 or 6 years of investigation and hearings, the examiner concluded that USIA was responsible. The findings stated that the tank had been underdesigned, poorly built, and inadequately tested. The company had ignored clear warning signs like leaks and noises. There was no credible evidence of sabotage. In essence, the flood was the predictable result of negligence. The company was ordered to pay significant damages to victims and their families. Estimates of the total payout in modern terms run into the many millions of dollars. While no amount of compensation could undo the deaths and injuries, the ruling sent a powerful message. Companies could be held legally and financially accountable for the safety of their structures and the risks they imposed on surrounding communities. The Great Molasses Flood ended up having a broader legacy far beyond one Boston neighborhood. In the years that followed, cities and states strengthened building codes and regulations. The idea that someone could throw up a massive industrial tank in a crowded residential area without serious engineering oversight became far less acceptable. Engineers began to play a more formal role in certifying designs and reviewing structures for safety. The disaster helped push American law and practice toward a world where standards, inspections, and accountability were expected. There is also a social side to this story. The North End in 1919 was home to many Italian immigrants and working-class families. Most of them had little political power or influence. When something went wrong, companies could be tempted to dismiss their complaints. The molasses tank had been leaking and scaring neighbors for years, but people's concerns were brushed off. After the flood, it became harder to ignore the voices of those living in the shadows of industrial facilities. the disaster highlighted how often the poorest or least powerful communities end up bearing the greatest risks. Even today, engineers, historians, and safety experts still talk about the Great Molasses Flood. Fluid dynamics researchers have studied how a dense liquid like molasses behaves when a huge quantity is suddenly released, using the event as a real-world case study. Legal scholars point to the flood as an early example of mass tort litigation and corporate liability. Urban historians see it as a moment when the demands of industry literally spilled into the streets, with deadly results. For most people, though, the story sticks in the mind because it sounds almost surreal. A tidal wave of syrup destroying part of a city. It forces you to rethink what a disaster looks like. Not every catastrophe comes in the form of a fire, or an earthquake, or a war. Sometimes it comes from a slow, everyday thing. A tank, a pipe, a chemical, that everyone has learned to ignore until the moment it fails.